Today is Sunday, January 5th, 2025. Wow.
I know.
And this is episode 291 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Catlett.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bell. How are you today?
I'm awesome. How are you doing?
Good. I'm good. It's 2025, like you said. Just kind of crazy. But
living in the future.
Where's my flying cars?
Seriously. Well, you know, we got UFOs all over the place, or drones, or UAPs, or whatever the heck they are. So
it's true. It's an interesting time. And you know, for the record, if anybody wants, somebody who's not afraid to voice his opinion, who's spent 30 years in aviation, on your podcast, I charge a nominal fee. Just saying.
There you go.
I'll be happy to talk about drones and aviation with you. Whatever conspiracy theory you want me to support, I can be bought.
Yeah. Good.
Like
so, but before you go any further, I should say that the thoughts and opinions we express are ours and not those of our employer, not necessarily, at least.
It is funny, though. But, I was always an old school dabbler in conspiracy theory before it was cool. And now everybody does it all day long on social media. And I'm like,
it's boring.
All the coolness is gone. It's like I was into a band before it was cool.
Like a conspiracy theorist hipster.
Basically. I'm an OG. Now everybody thinks they're on X-Files.
That's right. So everybody should just wish us well, because here in Atlanta, there's a remote chance of snow this coming Friday. We may or may not have a chance to record again. I don't know.
I've already started preluding my neighbors.
As you should.
I mean, It's 51 degrees and cloudy with not a trace of precipitation, but you just never know.
Look, it could happen. There could be some snowflakes on the ground, and then
Atlanta.
What are you gonna do?
We just don't handle it well. So loot early, loot often is what I like to say in these circumstances. My neighbors are not as, let's just say, enthused about my hobby.
Well, everybody's gotta be good at something. So let's get into some stories today.
Good plan.
Our first one comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is Bad Tenable Plugin Update Takes Down Nessus Agents Worldwide. So this is similar, although not nearly as bad as what happened to CrowdStrike about 6 months ago. Nessus pushed out a agent fix. I think it was version 10.8.0 and 10.8.1 that, when installed, causes the agent to become unresponsive. And they've since released a new version, 10.8.2, which fixes the problem. However, it has to be manually installed. And so for those of you who have large estates, that's going to be perhaps a little inconvenient, but I guess you hopefully have some sort of IT management software to take care of that for you.
Great time to test that process out.
Yes. It's disappointing. I suppose it's a little disappointing that companies in this space that have agents like that didn't take the opportunity. Obviously, I don't know the inner workings of Tenable, so maybe they did, and I'm being unfair, but I would have assumed that in the wake of the CrowdStrike event, as we'll call it, companies that produce agents like this would have taken a very close look at their testing and release process to avoid similar fates. But
and the upside is it just took down the process. It didn't take down the machine.
True. But it's an important process, right? This is a key part of the security infrastructure for a lot of organizations.
Indeed. And as an aside, I think we'd be remiss not to mention that the CEO of Tenable, Amit Yaron, just passed away from cancer, unfortunately.
Yeah, so, very young. And I say that because he's just a little bit older than me.
Yeah. So
I was very
thoughts
sad.
and prayers to all of his friends and families on that. I personally didn't know, but I know a lot of people at Tenable, and there's huge outpouring of support. So, appears to be a well-loved guy.
Everybody that I've talked to who knows him said that he was a really, really good guy. He was a mentor and friend to a lot of people. So I, like you, I didn't know him, but I know he's very well missed.
But back to his crappy software. Now,
yes.
I think this just goes to prove that this is going to happen, and you probably have to plan for these sorts of events as best you can.
Yes.
War game out, tabletop game out. If this key piece of software goes down, how does that impact us? What do we do? Can we recover? This is another good reminder of that, I think.
Right. I suspect where the nightmare scenario comes in with this is if it was paired with some really critical vulnerability that you needed to have that capability available. Fortunately, there hasn't really been anything like that at the moment, but that sort of thing can pop up at any time. And this is the way that a lot of organizations identify where serious vulnerabilities exist and help prioritize remediation.
Maybe like in malicious Chrome extensions. Hint, hint.
Yes, which is a great segue to our next story, which also comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title is New Details. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's almost like I read ahead.
It's almost like you knew what was coming up, yes. So this, by the way, just for those of you who are following along, is a follow-up to a story we covered last week. Last week, we talked about a browser plugin from a company called Cyberhaven that had been hacked, and actually really not hacked, but replaced with a malicious version that was stealing credentials. And so this is a follow-up to that. A lot more details have come out on how it happened. At the time last week, we were at least I was kind of scratching my head on what Cyberhaven had done wrong that allowed a bad actor to access their Chrome store account. And this article actually explains that in pretty good detail. And by the way, it was not just Cyberhaven's extension. It was a total of 35 or perhaps even more extensions that were impacted, with a collective estate of about 2.6 million installs, which is fair number
that we know of so far.
I mean, yeah, it sounds like it could be it could be bigger than that, but what they have been able to track down as of now indicates that it was 35 extensions covering about 2.6 million installs. So the way this happened was a phishing email was sent out to the owners of a number of different extensions, and it was a larger set than just the 35. I don't exactly know how many went out, but it was certainly kind of a en masse spear phishing attack, and it took a very clever alternative to bypass multi-factor. So they actually did have multi-factor authentication enabled, and it did not bypass that. It did not hack their accounts. But what it did was present an email that basically told the maintainer of the plugins that their plugin was violating some aspect of the Chrome store's rules. It looked very official, and it had a link to it had a button with a link to a somewhat official-looking URL. And when you clicked on that URL, it then took you to another Google page, which was in GCP, that asked the victim here to basically establish an OAuth trust between an application that the attacker was using, and that application actually had a fairly legitimate looking name called Privacy Policy Extension, which existed in Google's cloud. And if you accepted that application now had OAuth access, because you were granting certain rights to it, to your Chrome store account. And one of the rights that it granted the adversary was the ability to replace the plugin that you had for offer. And so that's exactly what happened. And then for each of those plugins, the adversary was fairly sophisticated in this. They created specific domains to collect information from the plugin. Now remember that these plugins were altered to collect login information from the end victim's web browsers. There's more information about that too. This was apparently very focused on collecting Facebook business login information, allegedly, apparently for the purpose of stealing money and perpetuating other scams. But they were...
Which is surprising, because I consider most businesses on Facebook a scam in and of themselves.
The irony is not lost on me.
So for all the effort for this fairly sophisticated and effective campaign, it seemed like a somewhat low-level goal, Facebook business account logins, but maybe there's more to it.
Yeah, it's unclear if this is the end of if we've hit bedrock on what's going on here. But
I mean, inevitably they'll be pimping some sort of crypto coin. That's what must happen by law. It all
leads back to crypto. Yes.
Sorry, come on.
It really does. One of the concerns that I have, and this is, I think, where you were going. This is a very sophisticated, or at least what we would have in the past called a very sophisticated attack. It's tailored to each individual, plugin's owner. They're actually registering bespoke domains so that if one of the end victims looks at the traffic that is leaving, it looks like it's going to a domain associated with the plugin that they have installed. So they went through some pretty extensive lengths to make it look legitimate. So, I guess kudos to the Cyberhaven people, because I think without them, I'm not sure this would have been known. But I think they're the ones that figured out that this was going on. So, again, kudos to them. But this I think, and I'm concerned about this going forward, is a sophisticated attack for, I don't want to call it pedestrian, but I am going to call it pedestrian, for kind of pedestrian purposes. It's like run-of-the-mill cybercrime type stuff using what we would have in the past called pretty advanced tactics. So I'm a little, it causes me some pause. Let's say it that way.
Yeah, I would agree. It was effective too. And one thing I was looking at is they've got some details of what the phishing email said, which I thought was interesting. And just dissecting this a little bit, the phishing email, which appeared to come, I'm quoting from the article here. The phishing email, which is made to appear as if it comes from Google, claims that the extension is in violation of the Chrome Web Store policies and is at risk of being removed. Quote, "We do not allow extensions with misleading, poorly formatted, non-descriptive, irrelevant, excessive, or inappropriate metadata, including but not limited to the extension description, developer name, title, icon, screenshots, and promotional images." And then, it goes on and gives a link to fix it, which is what ends up granting the permissions and the rights to go modify it. But this is very classic phishing technique that I think is worth calling out. There's a sense of urgency that, hey, if you don't do this, we're going to rip down your extension and you won't have it published. It's a position of authority coming to tell you this. It feels like your job could be at risk because it's basically saying you did something wrong as the Chrome extension developer, and this may get you in trouble if you don't fix it as soon as possible. And all these things are there. Plus, you've got MFA enabled for most of these folks. Your creds aren't being compromised. It's a very clever attack that pushes all the psychological attack buttons to get people to follow the link and grant this permission to modify their Chrome extension. So yeah, there's a decent level of sophistication here that it was effective. And we only know 35. We don't know how many others might have been targeted as well. Maybe that will come out, but there's more investigation ongoing. But to your point, it does seem a lot of effort or a lot of sophistication for what appears to be low-level wins, relatively speaking.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see if there's any sort of metrics that come out about how much damage they were able to do with access. I'm assuming they were successful in exfiltrating some number of Facebook business account credentials from the 2.6 million. There's no indication of that in this article, but would be be very interesting to know how lucrative this was. Maybe this is, a very financially viable attack that we're just not, we're underplaying or underselling. But on its surface, it looks like a lot of effort for what they, at least to me, seems like they would have gotten out of it. More to come, I'm sure.
Indeed. It's interesting, though. Very interesting little attack.
Yeah. The thing that I thought, I mean, other than, this is as an attack tactic, the thing that I found most interesting was the attack on OAuth, right? It's not violating, the protocol. It's, there is no vulnerability here. It's just that people are being tricked into establishing a trust relationship with some untrustworthy application. And that as a tactic doesn't rely phishing resistant credentials don't help there. Multi-factor authentication doesn't help there. This is like fundamentally different type of problem than we've seen in the past. I'm not going to say it's new. I mean, I think we've seen this in the past. There's been some issues with Microsoft Azure Active Directory, or Entra, I guess is what they call it these days, where similar things have happened. I think it's something to be aware of, and certainly something that I think we're going to have to start factoring into our security awareness training, because I'm not aware that anybody is covering that.
Yeah, and it's a tough one. I mean, you're basically telling your employees, think very carefully before granting permissions, and they're very used to just clicking through those boxes. Very used to it. So it's because we were sort of riffing on the last time. Did they have MFA turned off? Like, how did they get so easily popped? This is far more sophisticated of an attack than we were sort of anticipating when we first started about this.
Yeah, definitely. So I my hat's off to Cyberhaven for figuring out it happened and calling it out. So,
I mean, the only thing that I could think of that would help is going after the initial inbound phishing email coming from maybe a recently registered domain and kind of trusting that, or having some sort of secure web proxy that also limited what websites you go to based on recent. But that's easy to get around if you're a bad guy. I don't know. I got to do some more thinking on this one. It's a pretty clever one.
Yeah, for sure. All right, our next story comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is New HIPAA Cybersecurity Rules Pull No Punches. So in the U.S. here, I think everybody, even outside of the U.S., is probably familiar with HIPAA. HIPAA was published back in 1996, and it was last updated in early 2013, so like 11 years ago. And realistically, the HIPAA law initially was very much focused on privacy. It was to help enable a move to electronic health records. And so it was very focused on privacy, not necessarily focused on security. And when you look under the covers, I had a lot of experience with HIPAA in my prior life. There's a lot to not like about it, at least from a security perspective, because a lot of the nuts and bolts of what's in HIPAA were considered addressable requirements. And by addressable, it's kind of like optional. It was probably oversimplifying it to a fault. So if you're, screaming at your radio right now, stand down a little bit. But what these new updates do is both expand the scope of what HIPAA will require, but also remove some of that subjectivity. So that I don't know if it's everywhere, but they are largely getting rid of the concept of addressable requirements. So by the way, these requirements, the new proposed set of rules, are being published in the Federal Register tomorrow, actually, January 6th. And there'll be, I think it's a 60-day comment period, and then that will get turned into a final set of rules. That, by the way, is a little unclear because there's going to be a change in administration. It's very unclear exactly when this will see the light of day, but after the new rules are published, there'll be a 6-month phase-in period. So it's conceivable that the new rules go into place by the end of the year. I'm a little skeptical, just based on my past experience. And by the way, the set of rules right now is about 400 pages, so it's a fairly weighty set. But there is a good summary linked from this particular story. And I'll just kind of read through the summary. One is that all of your policies, procedures, plans, and analysis will need to be documented in writing. You'll have to have a documented incident response plan with an ability to restore your information systems and data within 72 hours, which is interesting because a lot of the existing programs, compliance laws, and regulations require you to disclose within 72 hours. This is saying you have to have things back up and running within 72 hours, which makes sense, but it makes sense in the context of healthcare. Like I can't disagree, but it is aggressive. And we'll get to that in a minute. Asset inventory, you have to have an asset inventory, a network map to be able to track the flow of PHI through your environment. You have to perform a risk assessment, written risk assessments, additional security controls like multi-factor authentication. PHI has to be, protected health information has to be encrypted, both in transit and at rest. Those were, by the way, addressable controls in the past. You have to have... go ahead.
Can we riff on that for a second? Addressable controls, because we've used that term a few times. And I think what that means is, I don't want to use the word optional, but there seemed like there were different layers of HIPAA requirements based on the size of your practice. And what we're saying is that that's going away. Now, these are requirements across the board. If you're a one-man shop, or as they use in the article, a large East Coast hospital, now there's no longer a concept of, if you're a small shop, certain things weren't required. Everything's going to be required across the board now.
Yeah, everything's going to be required everywhere. The concept of addressable was on a couple different dimensions. One was based on size, but also, I think more to the point, based on attributes of your environment. Like my network doesn't have any exposure to the internet, therefore I don't need encryption.
Got it.
And so therefore I don't need it. So just to carry on for that, I'm going to be releasing the conversation we had with Martin Fisher, who was the CISO of a hospital network here in the Atlanta area. We had a good discussion with him about security in healthcare. And it's a different world, right? Because the kinds of technology you have to work with are a limiting factor. Like you're constrained by the environment that you have to work within. You're constrained by the reality of what you're trying to accomplish. Your mission is to keep people alive. And so it is going to be very interesting, because as I read it, at least on its surface, the objectives of this, like in calling some things non-addressable, seems to be at odds with the reality on the ground. And I'm not talking about necessarily like cost or convenience. Like I don't know, but especially when I reflect on the discussion we had with Martin, how some of these will actually work, because the technology may just not be compatible, and
so maybe at odds with ease of patient care or best patient care.
Exactly.
Yeah. And one thing they call out in here too is that for these small organizations, there will be a substantial cost that likely will be passed along to consumers as well.
Which is an amazing thing, given the amount that healthcare costs in the U.S. already. The current administration is saying that they expect this set of changes to cost about $9 billion collectively in the first year, and then I think dropping to $6 billion per year after that, which, I mean, it's a lot of money, but that's amortized across probably tens or hundreds of thousands of different medical practices across the U.S.
Right. So you mentioned this conversation with Martin Fisher. Where might someone find that when it's public?
Tomorrow, but which will probably, by the time most people listen to this, it'll be it'll already be out. But you can get it at Getting Defensive.
So that would be our companion podcast where we interview industry leaders.
That's right.
On the Getting, and you could find that on, I think, every major podcast app and YouTube.
Correct.
Shameless plug.
It's an awesome podcast, if I do say so myself. And by the way, that was a particularly good discussion too. Martin was a good human.
He is. He recently retired or it's kind of wrapped up a long time as a healthcare CISO. So he has seen some things, and he has certainly put in his time. Anyway, check it out. It's a good discussion. So that'll go out tomorrow, January 6th. Got it.
Yes.
So thus ends my shameless plug. Back to your story.
So we'll know more after the proposed rulemaking has been out for a little bit. Again, it'll almost certainly not materialize as something we have to worry about till the end of the year. But we don't really know. My guess is, especially in the U.S., there's a lot of lobbying, I guess is the way I'll describe it. There'll be a lot of input from industry. It'll be interesting to see how much of that is taken up by the Department of Health and Human Services as they reshape this regulation. And we know that the new administration has I think a very different philosophy on regulation, although perhaps not in this area. So I don't want to presuppose anything. I think we'll have to kind of wait and see. But it is, I think, beyond time. Although I will say, stumbling over my words here, one of the frustrations I have is that we have yet another effectively cyber requirement, right? And when you look across, we have rules coming out from the Securities and Exchange Commission and from the FFIC for banks. And now we have rules coming out of CISA for critical infrastructure companies and on and on and on. And they're effectively trying to do a lot of the same things. There's huge amounts of overlap. I hope personally that at some point we start to see a bit of rationalization across, because again, a lot of these are trying to accomplish the same mission. There's some nuance. Obviously, the things in healthcare, like what matters in healthcare is different than what matters in, let's say, critical infrastructure or banking, right? There things that matter most are a bit different, but the things that you have to do tend to be very similar. And so I see a lot of opportunity for some harmonization, which I think would create some scale, some efficiencies for compliance and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also want to kind of riff off one thing I saw in the article too. They were quoting Errol Weiss, hopefully I got the name right, Chief Information Security Officer at the Healthcare Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the Health ISAC. And he mentioned that what typically has happened and what he thinks will continue to happen is that instead of organizations using these HIPAA recommendations or it's as a baseline for developing a robust security posture, organizations tend to treat HIPAA more as a set of boxes to check, quote, and end up driving budget towards compliance, not necessarily security. And that is absolutely something I saw repeatedly in the banking industry with PCI. If you were, people would go up to what PCI said they had to do and not an inch further. And that I think could be an unintended bad consequence. So then you end up mandating security through regulatory action, which is usually very behind the state, of the bad actors. So it's not great. The other thing that's interesting is the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron doctrine last year, which in many ways is what gave the power to these various organizations to pass, in essence, laws, which, I'm certainly not a lawyer, but my, rudimentary understanding is that with the Chevron doctrine gone, these various organizations that are impacted by this rulemaking authority of these various departments can challenge it now, saying, no, this should go to Congress to pass a law through Congress. And we don't recognize the authority of the power of law being mandated by this organization. That's my very loose understanding. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a decent amount of lawsuits challenging some of these regulations as another avenue for those who don't want the burden of these regulations to appear.
We certainly see that starting to happen. Most recently, there was one within the past week about net neutrality. But I don't know the answer to this one, by the way. So my understanding of that ruling, I forget the name right now of the Supreme Court case that overturned the Chevron doctrine. It basically says that the agencies can't just take up the mantle and kind of backfill prescription. They can't prescribe what regulations mean outside of what Congress has said. But Congress can explicitly say in a law that, for example, Health and Human Services is responsible for determining what it means to comply with HIPAA. And if that's the case, then what the Supreme Court did with the Chevron doctrine doesn't apply. Now, I don't know if that's, I'm not that familiar with the actual content of the HIPAA law itself, but it could be that it says that Health and Human Services is deputized to do that. And if that's the case, then that ruling doesn't apply. But if it doesn't, then you're correct.
So what we're saying is we're dangerously ill-informed on something we're commenting on. That's what it really comes down to. We don't know what we're talking about at all. We're just filming.
I depending on how this comes out and depending on how much it costs, we probably will see lawsuits either way. So we'll see how that plays out. But my guess is we're not going to know a lot until, again, either later this year or this time next year. So, more to come. But it's overdue. However this lands, the protections that we have in the U.S. are way behind on healthcare information. And as you pointed out, based on the comments from the CISO of Health ISAC, this is the bar that a lot of organizations are using, and that's just, it's not sufficient in the modern world. It just isn't, and so something has to change. The other thought that I had was very interesting. I was very involved in the early days of the rollout of GDPR in a big company, and industry wide. One of the net effects of GDPR was creating this role of a data protection officer in organizations, because you had to have, like, it's in the GDPR rule that you have to have a data protection officer, and it created this like whole new like job market for data protection officers. And
they didn't just appoint a random executive admin or secretary to be that person.
Well, I'm not going to say that hasn't happened. I won't go that far, but I think what we saw, because there's a lot of small organizations. Like, you can't, if you're a flower shop that has online ordering, like, you can't employ a dedicated data protection officer, but you don't need to either, and so it's created a market for fractional data protection officers, and at the very end of this article, it does point out that this is likely to drive a lot of, especially the smaller healthcare organizations, to involve or engage their own CISO, like called virtual CISOs or fractional CISOs. So I'm kind of seeing, although it's not necessarily explicitly written into the proposed rulemaking for HIPAA, it feels like it could have the same net effect of what GDPR did.
Yeah, could be. Or are you looking for some virtual CISO gigs? Is that what you're saying, Jerry?
Yeah, it was exactly where I was going. Like, as somebody who's recently unemployed and formerly a CISO, like, hey, like, this is a good opportunity for me.
And you could say, virtually, you're a CISO.
Yes, virtually.
It'll be interesting to watch. And to be clear, by the way, I'm not against healthcare security. I can tell maybe my earlier comments had to come across as I was a little anti. I think my concern is that when you wrap a regulation or a legislation around it, it's usually very slow to be responsive to current threat. And we see, like you said, over and over in this particular discussion, when you've got this sort of regulation, businesses use that as the line, and they typically don't go further. That's the unintended consequence that I fear.
I think so. What would be interesting, and I think GDPR tried to do it a little bit, and they didn't do a very good job of it, in Jerry's unvarnished opinion, is to somewhat legislate that concept, right? That there isn't a bar. Like, you need to figure out what's appropriate and then do that, which is sensible.
But that drives executives and lawyers crazy.
I know. It does. It really does, because there's no safe harbor. It is kind of like, if something bad happens, you didn't do enough, and therefore you broke the law. And that causes untold consternation. But at the same time, what's the counter? What's the contra, right? The contra is you end up with something that's prescriptive and lags the threat landscape and doesn't properly protect you. And more mature and sophisticated organizations, sure, they'll do a better job, but that's not universally true. I mean, look at like Change Healthcare. They hit a huge outage, and among the largest in the world. So it's not necessarily a function of size. At the same time, like a small family practice, local single office family practice is not, is not going to, on their own, going to go and employ a CISO to figure out what kind of security they should have. It's maybe some will, but I think the majority won't.
Yeah. It's an interesting world. And I'm sure there are trade groups and things like whatever these small healthcare association newsletter is. I'm sure they talk about this stuff and, have little sections on that. But
I do think pragmatically too. So we see a similar thing in banking. Like large banks run their own IT. Like really large banks run their own IT. Everybody else contracts with like Jack Henry or Fiserv or what have you. I think this is going to drive a similar kind of thing where it's no longer going to be feasible for healthcare providers to do their own IT. I mean, unless you're like a really large company, I think you're going to end up having to go with some kind of a hosted system. So anyway, enough pontificating on crap that we don't understand.
Well, if that's the rule, we should just shut the show down right now. We're done.
Okay, on that particular topic. Now we're going to pontificate on other stuff that we don't know about. So this next one comes from Ars Technica, and the title here is AI-generated phishing emails are getting very good at targeting executives. So the story here is that bad actors are starting to use AI or large language models to create very, very targeted phishing emails at scale. So I would say, like, in the past, we've thought about spear phishing emails as as something that was in the realm of a very targeted attack. But what this article is pointing out is that there is an emergence of an opportunity for bad actors to use these LLMs to create at scale hyper-targeted emails that are very specific to the organization, to the person, based on their background and whatnot, to do who knows what. Right? I think the point, they're not calling out any specific instances in this article, rather the concept that you can go to ChatGPT or one of the many other LLMs out there and use that to go and create a very reasonable pretext over and over and over again for lots of people, and how difficult that is to defend against, because it's not something necessarily that you can program your email filter to block except outside of like where it originates from, but assuming it's coming from outlook.com or something like that, it's going to be really difficult to defend against. And as a class of threat, like this is one of the challenges I see ahead for us in the new AI world. You can love it, hate it, whatever, but it's here, and the bad guys are going to use it.
Yeah, the barrier to entry to do a very OSINT-rich targeted phishing attack is so low now that we're going to see. It used to be, hey, you got to put a lot of effort into this. Now you don't, and so that cost to do this has gone way down. So the way I think about this is you've got to target the goal of that phishing attack as your defense mechanism. So having a robust process of, if this sort of targeted phishing exercise or attack against an executive is to transfer money for this very urgent purchase that's happening in Europe, and so I need you to transfer $50,000 to this wire it to this account immediately. And, that just shouldn't be allowed no matter how urgent and demanding and threatening the email is. It has to go through whatever the process is. That's the only way I know to defend against this, is build robust processes that were resistant to some sort of phishing attack in this way. But even then, that's only one class. That's one type of attack we see against these. But if it's a typical trying to steal credentials and that sort of stuff, it goes back to, I don't know that we're going to stop the phishing emails. Now we have to target what are the outcomes those phishing emails are going after, and how do I introduce friction or road bumps into those to prevent something bad from happening.
That's right. We got to focus on less on the methodology, more on the perils. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, this is something actually I plan to tee up to send to my executives tomorrow. But honestly, education matters. But I'm just going to be very brutally honest. The executives of most of the companies I work with are so busy, they're going to read it and go, yeah, that makes sense. And then within 5 minutes, they're on to something else. And it usually doesn't resonate. Right? So how do you keep them safe?
Until something bad happens. And then the one thing I guess also along the same lines, I can see this also being used to target individual people too. And so, I've got elderly parents, many people do, and they're already falling for scams that are way dumber than this. Right. And not that my parents have, but in general, as a class, elderly people are falling for scams at an alarming rate and losing a lot of money. And I'm concerned, this is yet another avenue that we're going to see that happen. And so there's a line of thinking, by the way, when it comes to security awareness training, that you inject like protecting people at home as well as in the office, and it helps resonate more. So this is something to, I think, put into that pile. But you're right. There's not a good answer right now. I mean, I guess you could take the contents of your email and put it into your own LLM and ask, like, how likely is this to be a scam?
And I think some anti-phishing technology tries to do that. But again, the barrier to entry, the cost to entry to have a very targeted, crafted attack is so low that I think a lot of those defenses are not going to be sophisticated enough.
Yeah, but at least being aware of the threat is a start.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, our last story for today also comes from Ars Technica, and the title here is Passkey Technology is Elegant, but it's most definitely not usable security.
And boy, did this author lay out his case extensively.
He really did. Dan Gooden is a good guy, by the way. He's the author here. What the summary of his objection to Passkey is not that it's bad technology. It's actually, as he points out, very good technology. It's that it's so hyper fragmented. Like every vendor out there is trying to lock you into their of passkeys, and so like if you use Firefox, it's going to try. Firefox is going to try to get you to use passkeys stored in the Firefox browser, but that passkey is not going to be available to you on your iPhone through your iOS Safari browser, and so on. And so in that manner, it becomes incredibly frustrating for people who might not be technologically savvy to understand that, like, when I create a passkey in Firefox on my Mac or my Windows PC, that it's not going to be available to me in Safari on my phone. And that therein lies the rub, because people are going to throw up their hands and say, like, this sucks. I'm going back to passwords. I think the one, he calls it out like in multiple times, but I think it deserves more air cover, I guess, or more airtime, is using a password manager. And so for me, I use 1Password, and Dan actually in the article talks about his experience with 1Password as well. If you use a password manager that interoperates across all of your different devices, it becomes a lot less of a problem. You can, this is exactly how I operate. I do use passkeys pretty extensively, And when I am on my Windows PC and I try to log into a site that requires Passkey, 1Password pops up and asks me if I want to use my Passkey. And if I'm on my phone, which is iPhone, same deal. I don't have to worry about that kind of lock-in. But if I ever wanted to change from 1Password to something else, like, good heavens, I've got to go and reset all of my authentication because I'm locked into 1Password, and that's kind of the whole point. I think it's important, and I dare say it's becoming a bit of a crisis that as an industry we move to phishing resistant credentials. And I think what Dan is pointing out is that's a really problematic proposition given where we're at and the way that the different technology providers are trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I also think that, hey, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that it will continue to iterate and get better. I'm hoping that articles like this will help point out the problem and drive the industry to not necessarily silo their approach and have a shared unified vision, which would be nice. We're getting there. And I saw actually one of the comments on this article talked about one of the initiatives the FIDO Alliance is doing to hopefully help. The other thing I think about is, and this is mainly just from the lens of what we talk about in the show, which is enterprise or organizational security. I want to be careful about this because it's not that I don't care about the individual user, but in my little narrow scope of this conversation, I think this is less of a challenge in an enterprise environment because I usually have a fairly uniform environment and consistent environment that most of my users are operating in that I can help guide them in. I think where this challenge really occurs is cross-platform, cross-browser, cross-device, which is maybe more prevalent in an individual or non-enterprise user environment, but maybe I'm being too simplistic. I don't know.
Well, I think it's important though, as you're figuring out what your solution, your enterprise solution is, that you have to make sure that from a usability perspective, people aren't storing their, I guess it's not the end of the world if they do, but storing their passkeys in their browser versus in the password manager that you're providing. At least at the minimum, you're creating work for your help desk.
Yeah, that's true.
To say why can't I log in using my passkey from my phone? It works great on my desktop.
And there's some interesting implications there of the various security stances of these various tools. For instance, and I don't know the full details, but there was one of the examples in the articles was whether or not you store the passkey in your Mac environment, in your iCloud, keychain, or in the password manager coming with the browser. And without digging deep into those, I bet those have two very different risk models and protection models. And one may be far more robust. One may be using hardware level encryption. One may be just password protected sync at a cloud level. But usability matters, right? I've got to have portability of that passkey or what's the point? So there's a trade-off there.
Absolutely.
I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of riffing on, it's not perfect. It's a step in the right direction. It does help with your problems. I want it to get better. And I completely get the trade-off of usability versus friction and whether or not we get widespread adoption if it's too difficult to use. I get that. And I'm just hoping it'll continue to evolve, but I also think it's worth the problem. But I think the scope of this article or the goal of this article is for your non-technical users especially, it's too complicated right now. And he's not wrong.
And it gets easier if you standardize on something that is platform agnostic, like a 1Password.
Yeah. What does not get easier is your mom, because she's about as easy as it gets. I got to reward those who stuck around for 55 minutes.
Fair enough. All right. I think we've peaked and we're on our way back down now.
It's not a terribly disappointing note, as they used to say on Top Gear or Grand Tour.
There you go. All right. Thank you for listening. And thank you again, by the way, to our Patreon donors. If you do want to support our mission here, you can donate to our Patreon account. It's patreon.com/defensivesec. And again, thank you to everybody who has already donated to us.
Yeah, you guys are awesome. Thank you. And we really do appreciate it.
You can find the links we talked about in this podcast on our website at defensivesecurity.org. You can also find us on YouTube. It's at Defensive Podcast, I believe.
That sounds right.
And I guess the other thing I'll mention is we've started to try to make this particular podcast a little more consumable. So each of the stories is also available in a separate playlist as a distinct episode. So, for example, there'll be 5 separate episodes available for this podcast, as well as the full version.
On YouTube, though, we're not doing that on the standard podcast feed for...
That's correct. Okay. On YouTube. That's right.
Yeah. So, and hey, we're trying to get our listeners up. If you like the show and you find it valuable, tell a friend, tell an enemy, tell somebody, tell your parole officer, whatever you need to do.
Right. Anyway, thank you very much. If you want to follow me on social media, you can do that on my Mastodon server, infosec.exchange. It's at Jerry@infosec.exchange. And where can they find you?
I'm on both X and infosec.exchange with the same handle, at Lerg, Lerg.
Awesome. And with that, we will talk again next week. Take care, everybody.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.